Hey everyone, and welcome back or welcome to the VSL YouTube channel. I'm D.A. Edwards, a composer from Germany, and today I want to share something very exciting with you that I've been working on. In this video, I'm going to take you through my latest composition, Serpents of the Red Roof Valley, a piece for saxophone, piano, and percussion. This is all about how I composed it and made my mock-up with the beautiful instruments from the Vienna Symphonic Library, and I'll introduce you to a groundbreaking new practice tool that I've developed that opens up a totally new use case for sample software instruments. So stay tuned and let's get started. Serpents of the Red Roof Valley is my latest composition and a first for me in many ways. First of all, it's my first time really writing for saxophone. I've worked with saxophones before in some movie soundtracks, but I don't consider those to be actual works for the instrument.
Zumindest der Künstler hat sich immer etwas dabei überlegt.
Das ist ja nicht mehr der Punkt. Wille ist mehr als bloßes Zweckdenken. Spätestens heute ist Kunst immer das, was man eigentlich dazu sagt. Eine Idee haben, eine Idee nicht zu haben, Film zu machen, einen Film nicht zu machen, ist völlig einerlei. Wille gegen Absicht, das ist alles.
So I was really happy when I got commissioned to write this piece and to be able to dig more into the possibilities and sound characteristics of the alto saxophone. My second first on this piece was the percussion part. I've of course written a lot for percussion in the past, but this is almost more a percussion solo piece than a saxophone piece. I really had to consider some of the very quick instrument changes, and I had to really figure out how you'd even set up the instruments to be able to play it. And it's actually possible that I have to change a few things here and there once we get into rehearsals, because some of the changes are kinda nasty. At the very least, it should be a good challenge, and I hope it's gonna be a fun part to play for percussionists. But I should probably start from the beginning. When I first sat down and started to think about what I could write for saxophone, I felt honestly a bit uncertain and stuck. I felt too influenced by everything I had heard over the years that had saxophone in it, and it was difficult for me not to think of music that wasn't just jazz or strongly influenced by the few examples of saxophone in classical music that I knew. So at some point I just started sketching out a bunch of wild stuff, the very first ideas for melodies or even just rhythmic ideas I got into my head. But everything just dragged on or felt too boring or just uninteresting. I'm a very visual thinker, and I actually have a form of synesthesia where you experience music as images and vice versa. So you can imagine it like the moment I got a picture and melody in my head, it would already fade again. I just literally didn't get a clear picture in my head. But then I kind of looked back through the ideas I had written down, and suddenly one of them actually caught my attention again. It was the image of a small village sitting in a green valley. Small homes and cottages built of wood, sandstone, and red tiled roofs. And then a viaduct bridge going through it, kind of low on the ground, but on it was a steam train that was driven by a serpent. What? I have no idea what my brain is doing sometimes, but it's probably better to just not think about it. But anyway, in my head I started to walk through this village and look at all the many different vistas that came to me, and before I even knew it, I had the first minute or so written down. At this point I was only working with saxophone and piano, as that was what the original idea for the commission was. But then I just couldn't get some of these rhythmic ideas out of my head, and especially the steam train. So just for fun, I wrote in a snare drum part, and I immediately knew that this was going to be the piece. I ended up having a lot of fun with the percussion part, and I liked imagining how I'd play it. I have my crappy tiny setup here with a cheap snare drum, so I could get at least an idea for some of the stickings and how I'd switch to a different instrument. And I think it's a great resource as a composer to surround yourself with many different instruments so you can try out things and even just get inspired by holding and feeling them. Anyway, I needed to make sure that this was going to be possible for a single percussionist, because it's not always easy to get by many players for a piece like this, and it really should remain a trio. But luckily I knew of a couple of really cool tricks that would allow me to get some crazy sounding changes and make this instrumentation sound really full and rich in variety. First, you can get a lot of different colors out of a snare drum with different techniques, going closer to the rim or the center, rim shots, and all that stuff, but of course also by switching off the snare, which then even reveals some pitch differences at the different positions on the head. These are also things you can get done super realistically with the synchron percussion. And this way I was able to craft a very lifelike representation of the percussion part that wouldn't be possible with just the Sibelius playback. This will be important again in a little bit. Another thing that helps are some cool inventions percussionists came up with, like the machine castanets and the machine triangle. With these, you don't have to hold the castanets or the triangle, and you can then play them with your sticks or mallets. And that also means with the triangle, you get an open sound that remains sustained while you switch to another instrument. And you can see in a few places, there just isn't enough time to switch between the mallets for the xylophone and the normal sticks, but this is not a big problem, because if you're playing quieter dynamics on the snare drum anyway, you can actually just play it with the mallets. This way I'm able to get a lot of these really tight changes and even the illusions of some impossible ones. But since I needed to fit the xylophone, which is obviously a pitched percussion instrument, together with the other unpitched instruments into a single part, I needed to figure out a good layout for the sheet music. I decided the best way to find the perfect solution was to talk to the people who would have to read and interpret the sheet music. So I took to a group of percussionists, and as I had kind of expected, I actually got a bunch of conflicting answers at first. I made 3 initial versions of the layout, and each one was preferred by someone at some point. But in the end, we figured the best way would be to merge 2 of the versions, and this is how I ended up with this 4th version, where I have one part with 2 5-line staves. One for all the unpitched percussion instruments, and one for the xylophone. It's important to stay consistent with the positions of the instruments on the lines, but you should still have the instrument changes written very clearly with boxed text above the staff. For the positions, it made sense to go with what is already most commonly done in other repertoire, so here I have the snare drum on the 3rd space, tambourine on the 2nd line, the triangle in the 4th space, and finally my castanets on the 1st space above the staff. As you can hopefully see, this way the layout has become very clear, and you can at a glance see what instrument you're supposed to play, and no instrument gets in the way of another in the parts where multiple instruments are played at the same time. And as I mentioned earlier, being able to show what I mean with a realistic sounding mockup was really helpful here for communication purposes, and that's one reason why I think it's really important to have this kind of resource for a new piece. Now I did say it's a single percussion part, but technically this piece is actually for 2 percussionists, because in a way, a piano is also a percussion instrument. I'm kidding, of course, but only a little bit. The piano is, of course, a keyboard instrument, but it is also part of both the percussion and the string family. It depends a bit on who you ask. And I actually am using it in a very percussive way too. The piano part I wrote for Serpents is very typical for me. Lots of staccato, very percussive, and very rhythmic with wide and complex, often dissonant harmonies and melodic content. I don't like it when instruments act only as an accompaniment to a main or a solo instrument. And here too I think the piano part is just like the percussion and the saxophone, not only of equal importance, but is intertwined with the other instruments, so they all become one with another, and none of them are just at the background. And something I like to do a few times on this piece was to double the saxophone with the piano a few octaves up to give it a totally different character. It really accentuates the overtones of the saxophone, and together they almost become a new instrument. These again are some things that I couldn't experiment with very easily if I weren't using virtual instruments that actually sound like the real deal. For my digital interpretation, I used the Synchron Fazioli F212, a beautiful piano and a beautiful plugin. I had actually sworn on physically modeled pianos for a while, but when I got my hands on the Synchron Fazioli F308 a while ago, it was pretty much the only piano I used ever since. I actually made another video where I talked just about this a while ago, also here on the VSL YouTube channel. So if you're interested in seeing that after this video, you'll find a link to that in the video description. Now for the saxophone, I had to consider a few things. The saxophone is a very flexible instrument with all sorts of extended techniques. It can be played very virtuosic and you can do a lot with the colors and textures of the sound. But there are some limitations or difficulties that have to be considered when you write for it. First of all, like on many instruments, there are some fingerings in the upper and lower register that are pretty uncomfortable to play. So here I had to be careful not to write very fast passages there. And I like to mark those kind of risky areas in my piano roll, so while I'm writing I can always check whether I'm getting into a dangerous range and maybe have to reconsider how I'm writing it. And I also marked specific changes that would be uncomfortable or difficult to play at speed, especially when they're supposed to be slurred. So while professionals would probably be able to figure something out for those, it's better not to ask players to do constant tremolos and fast downward slurs between those notes. Serpents is also very difficult to play and definitely not a piece for beginners because of other reasons. For example, the high passages where you need to be able to achieve flageolet tones, or as saxophonists like to call it, high tones or the altissimo register. I wrote those passages with a lot of melodic motion as well, so the saxophonist needs to be comfortable in that register, and it's something you shouldn't do for a piece that's intended for beginners. So you see, it's very important to research the instruments you write for and talk with professional players about what is possible or what's more challenging, and also spend some time with the instruments and even try playing them yourself. And then of course for my mockup it was important to use a plugin that could then of course do all of these things. I used the synchronized alto saxophone, which let me do pretty much all of the things you can do with a real saxophone, so it was very nice to be able to hear those slides and glissandi, for example, actually working and sounding good. It's really cool too that you get pretty much a full set of saxophones with the synchronized saxophones. You get a soprano saxophone, an alto, a tenor, a baritone, and even a bass saxophone. Now, since they're from the synchronized series, that means they're the original dry samples from the Vienna Instruments series, re-edited, reverberated, and brought into the synchron player to sound as if they're in the synchron stage. The great thing about that is that the dry samples are still there, and you can access them through the mixer preset 99mir unprocessed. And this was super useful in my case, because for this mockup I wanted to bring this special ensemble together in the same room, and for that I used MirPro 3D. And this still works fine with the other instruments too, even if they're not perfectly dry, but choosing the closed microphones on those and tweaking the mix and the EQ a bit can lead you to the right results that you want. As you can see, with the synchron and synchronized instruments, I'm able to give my digital interpretations so much life and detail, and to me this is, as I often like to say, my way of performing my own pieces, and this is why I love working this way so much, and this is why I call my mockups my digital interpretation. While listening to my music this way, I sometimes catch myself feeling like I'm actually listening to a real recording, and this is something I'm kind of proud of. But my goal isn't actually for my music to stay just in the software form. The whole point for a piece like this is, to me, to be performed and heard by live audiences. I wanted to live on beyond my own interpretation, so it's very important to me to get my new works played by musicians. And that's actually where this digital interpretation actually comes in very useful again for the musicians. A piece like this that has to be very tight and has so many frequent time signature changes is very challenging to play together, so it's important to be able to practice with the other musicians. But scheduling many rehearsals with everyone present eats up a lot of time and resources, and is often just not possible with people's schedules. So a common tool a lot of musicians have used for practice is to just playing alongside a recording to simulate playing with others. Since this piece is new, and there obviously isn't a recording yet, my digital interpretation that I created with the Vienna Symphonic Library is a great step in the right direction. It sounds very realistic and lifelike, and is a good representation of what I want out of the piece, and so it can serve as a baseline and a play-along for practice. But the drawback of any kind of recording or digital interpretation is hearing someone else playing your own part with you. In instrument method books, this issue has been addressed in the past by providing play-along CDs with both a full track and an additional one missing your instrument, so you can play and practice alongside the other musicians on the CD. But Serpents isn't just a lesson book for one instrument, and each instrument would have to practice on their own and would need their own individual practice track. That means I'd have to deliver at least 4 audio files to the ensemble, and if I also wanted to include an optional click track, the number of files would multiply exponentially. Also, of course, with each additional instrument when we're talking about my other works. This would take up a lot more storage space than just 1 or 2 files. I'd then have to figure out how I could deliver it to the musicians, and they'd have to figure out how they could even store it. And navigating such a big archive with so many different versions of basically the same thing could get very confusing very quickly. But this is where my new tool that I mentioned at the start comes in. It's a sort of audio player that I programmed for my website, specifically intended for musicians who want to study and perform my music. With this, you can of course listen to the music you're practicing, but as you can see, it's not just a regular audio player. Instead, you can enable and disable individual instruments, you can change their loudness, and you get a metronome track with all the correct time signature changes. You can also slow down the tempo a bit, but I limited how slow you can go because it's just slowing down the audio files, which will introduce artifacts and just sound strange when you push it too far. But this way you can listen to the whole piece, you can turn off your own instrument so you can play with the others, you can decide to practice with just 1 or 2 of the other instruments, you can practice with just the click track, and of course you can listen to the voices in isolation to hear what's going on in each part, or even just to check out your own part in more detail without being distracted by the other instruments. And this is especially useful in the case of Serpents, because here there are some doubled parts or intertwined melodic lines where it could be kind of useful to hear what each voice is doing individually. And the way this works is actually pretty simple. I just exported all of my instruments and the click track separately, and then in the tool I basically just play them all at the same time, which then allows the user to create their own custom mix on the fly with any combination of the instruments. And this would be possible to create with real recordings of musicians, but those recordings would be pretty hard to pull off. First of all, you'd of course be right back to the start. You'd have to have all the musicians on hand, and they themselves have to have practiced it the old way. And then, since each part needs to be in complete isolation, you'd either have to record each part separately, which wouldn't be a lot of fun for the musicians, or you could try to get a cleaner recording of the individual instruments in an ensemble setting, but you'd always hear the other instruments bleed into the microphone for an individual one. So it would never be perfect, and it just wouldn't be all that great. And that is where I found a great new use for sampled instruments like the ones from VSL, because they're obviously already perfectly isolated to begin with. With this, the process then becomes hilariously simple by just exporting the individual stems from the mixer and inserting those into my tool. I actually had the idea for this for a while now, and I actually thought about creating it last year when I composed Inspector Tabby, but I was too busy with other things, and in the end it was simple enough for that to deal with a couple of individual tracks, because it was after all just a duo. But now I'm planning to really deploy this and make a dynamic play-along for as many of my pieces as possible and link to them in future print and digital editions of my sheet music, because I think it is just that useful. Now, if you're interested in that concept and would like to make your own version of this tool, then let's get in touch and talk about it in the comments, or just send me an email at contact@edwards-music.com. But that was enough talk about software and technicalities for today. I think you've got a pretty good idea now of the capabilities of the Vienna Symphonic Library and its many and sometimes unexpected use cases. But now it's time to focus on what actually matters and what all this is for. So I leave you with this short little outro where you can click on the next video to listen to my digital interpretation of Serpents of the Red Roof Valley in full and enjoy this piece and this journey through a place I guarantee you've never been to before. A link to my YouTube channel and all other relevant links are in the video description down below, so have fun listening and don't forget to check out the other videos on the VSL YouTube channel. Have fun!